Well, hey folks, this is John with Ozarks Backroads with you today. We're back in the Ozarks Backroads World Headquarters garage. We've got the mighty 650 V-Strom here, the 2019 V-Strom up on the chopping block today. We're going to be installing some cartridge emulators in the front forks. The damper rod dampening that comes stock in these is okay on the highway, more or less, but it really falls apart when you get on the dirt roads. You get in the washboards or you take sharp hits on rocks, and it just can't react fast enough, and it's just like you don't have any suspension at all. So today we're gonna try to fix that. We've got some cartridge emulators that we're gonna put in there. We're going to drill out the damper rods, do away with the dampening there on the damper rods, and give that job over to the fork emulators. So stick around, we'll see if we can improve the suspension here on our 2019 V-Strom 650. Well, we're over here at the workbench and we'll take a look at what we're going to put in our forks here. These are the cartridge emulators. Get up here where we can see them. These go down in the tube and they sit down on top of the damper rod. And I've already got one fork pulled apart. This is the damper rod that sits in the bottom of the leg. So these cartridges will slide down the tube here and sit right on top of these damper rods. And then the spring sits on top of the cartridge like so. And that's pretty much what we're going to do here. These are from Race Tech. Well, actually, I bought the emulators and the springs came from ProCycle. ProCycle.com. You can see it here. And I'll put the part numbers that I used down in the description below. You can see that. Right now, we're going to go on and I'll go back and we'll run over removing the forks from the bike and tearing the forks down. We'll go back and look at that now. If you want to skip ahead to just the install of the valves and putting the forks together and whatnot, you can skip ahead. I'll put the timeline, the time interval below right here, and you can just jump ahead to that if you're not interested in pulling the forks off the bike or disassembling the forks. The first thing I'm going to do is loosen up these upper pinch bolts and leave the lower ones tight. And then I want to go ahead and loosen these caps while I've got it still in the bike here. It'll make it easier to get those loose. It'll hold the tubes for me. There we go. So now we need to move on and get the front wheel off. We've got some brackets here that hold the brake line and the little ABS line as well, the sensor line here, the wire for it. So we'll take this out. Get all this stuff freed up. I'm going to put my screws back in so I don't have to wonder what goes where when it comes time to put all this back together. I think these are 12s or 14s on the 14 millimeters on these brake calipers. They're not just crazy tight. They don't need to be. They're not going anywhere. If I give that just a little twist, it'll push the pads in and make it pretty simple to put back on. So over on this side, we got the same thing with the caliper here. We got to get it off. I'm going to leave the fender bolted up here and here on this side for now and just pull the fork out of the other side and do it. And then I'll put the other fork back in, bolt the fender up, and then I'll unbolt the fender here and do this side. Do them one at a time.
So on our axle down here, we've got a pinch bolt that pinches the leg around the axle, the head of the axle here. So we got that out of there. And again, that's not all that tight. We'll look at the torque specs when we put all this back together, but okay. So we got that loose, and I've got my tire just sitting on the ground barely, and that allows the axle to just come out nice and easy. And I'm going to go ahead and pull these spacers off on either side. Keep them on the correct side here. See if that'll come out. Yeah. I've got the camera shot up the right fork leg here, up underneath the nose of the bike, and our pinch bolts on the lower triple tree. There's a pair of them, pair of 12 millimeter headed bolts right here. So we're going to have to loosen those up. Get those loose and make sure I don't get the wrench into my tube here. I don't want to nick my tube or anything or scratch it. I don't want to wind up with a seal leak later on. So now this fork tube will just slide out. The first thing I want to do on the disassembly on this is there's a bolt that runs up and bolts the damper rod into the bottom of the fork leg. Up in the end of this hole, you can see a bolt in there maybe. I'm going to have to use just a Long Allen key here. I've got a pair of vice grips on it. That will reach up plenty long to get into my bolt here. We'll see if we can crack it loose. It'd be great if I could get it out, but I'm not hopeful. This is full of oil, so it could make a mess here, but let's see if we can just crack it loose to start with. Okay, that wasn't too bad. It's loose. Yeah, it feels like it's going to come out of there. A lot of times they'll be Loctite. They'll use Loctite on these, and the whole damper rod will just spin. So you want to do this before you pull the spring out of this, because the spring is holding pressure down on the damper rod to help keep it from spinning when you take this bolt out. So that's kind of important. So I've got the bolt out of the damper rod. Now I'm ready to see if I can get the cap and the spring off. So I've got to keep some downward pressure on it as I unscrew it to keep from getting an oil bath when the spring jumps out. But I think it's got a ways to go here before that happens. There it is. Yeah, that wasn't too bad. So there's our over-length spacer we cut. So now we can go ahead and remove our spring, and it's going to be an oily mess. This thing's full of oil. We're going to do away with these springs, and we're going to go with the heavier spring. One thing you will notice, this is actually a variable rate spring. You see how the coils are tighter at the bottom, and then they get wider as you go up. So this spring will be softer initially, and then the farther you compress it, the more force it takes to compress it. And we're actually going to be putting in a straight rate, just a straight spring, but it's going to be heavier. We'll turn this upside down in the bucket. And there's our damper rod. It fell out. That bolt that we took out of the bottom of the fork leg went in here in the bottom of the damper rod. Bolted this rod down to the bottom of the fork leg. So we're going to go ahead and take the fork tube out of the leg here. So the first thing we need to do is just remove this wiper, this upper dust seal I guess, or just a wiper, and pry it up out of there. And there it goes. So there that is. The next thing, we have a retainer. So you can see the retainer in here that sits on top of the oil seal. It's just a wire retainer. You can see it all the way around here. That holds the oil seal down in place. We can pry that up and that'll pop right out. Now we can remove that. We can pull the tube out of the leg, and the way we do that, there's on the end of the tube down here at the bottom of the leg is a bushing. It's in a groove on the bottom of this tube, and when you pull that up, that bushing hits the upper bushing. That bushing, it sticks out. It's bigger than the tube, and it will catch the upper bushing that's pressed in here on the inside. So we can actually use it to just pull the bushing, the upper bushing out, just by doing this. And the seal will come with it. The seal will be on top of it. So there it is. We'll take a look at what we've got here. So my leg is totally empty now. There's nothing in it. And on this, the bottom of the tube, this is the upper bushing that was pressed right in the top of the leg here. Sits right here. That's this. This is the lower bushing. The lower bushing is right here. So you got two bushings at the fork leg. This one runs inside the leg, in the bore in the leg. The lower one does. The upper one, the tube is pressed into the leg, and the tube runs in the upper one. I think the first thing I'm going to do here with these cartridges, I've got to change this blue spring or this yellow spring out that's come on them. The springs have yellow paint on them, so I need to install the blue ones. So we'll go ahead. They've got a jam nut on the bottom of them right here. So we'll go ahead and remove this. And just unscrew that, hold the jam nut, and then underneath this spring here, there's a disc. And on the disc, if we look at it, it's got two holes in it and two dimples in it. And since we need a 3-hole disc, according to my setup sheet, I'm going to have to drill out one of these dimples the same diameter as these other two, which I believe is 1/8 of an inch. So I'll drill out the disc here in that one dimple, 1/8 of an inch hole through it, and that'll be my 3 holes. I'm just going to drill into this one of these dimples here. It's got 2 holes and 2 dimples in it. So I'm going to drill out one of the dimples, and that'll give me a 3-hole. My 2-hole disc is now a 3-hole disc. I've got 1 dimple left and 3 holes in it, so that's what they wanted, and those were 1/8 inch holes. All right, I got both of my little discs here drilled out, and I went ahead and took a small round, a fine file, a round file, and just kind of went around the inside, the top edge on either side of the holes, and smoothed them off with the file here. So I want to make sure this disc fits nice and flush down on this valve body. I don't want an edge sticking out of it. So I went ahead and did that on both sides and got them nice and smooth. So now we're ready to put our new spring in. We're going to put our blue spring on it here. And then this just simply slips through this disc we drilled out. And this goes down in the valve. There's a hole in the bottom of it that this screw goes into. I'm going to go ahead and start my jam nut and get it kind of run up close to the valve body and get it ready to
do its thing here in just a minute. It's a locking nut, so it's got a nylon insert in it. They're saying 3 turns of preload on this spring on these valves. So what they're saying for 3 turns of preload is just back this out until I have some play here in my spring. It's not the screw isn't quite holding it down yet, and we're just going to run that down until the play goes away, until it just snugs up right about there. Okay, I don't have any play. So now they're saying 3 turns of preload, which would be 1, 2, 3 turns right there. That's where they're saying to run that valve. So I'm going to hold the bolt where we set it and just run my jam nut down and tighten it down so the screw can't turn anymore. All right, I think we've got that jammed down pretty good. So I got 3 turns of preload that they were calling for on this spring. Got our blue spring on it, and then we've got our little disc here. We got our little disc here that sits on top, and it's got our 3 holes in it now. So we got our 3 holes, we've cleaned that up so our disc sits nice and flush there on top of the valve. And we got 3 turns of preload on our valve spring. So I'll do the other valve and then we'll move on here. The next thing we need to do before we assemble the fork here is we've got to drill out the hole, some holes into this damper rod. If you remember what I said in the introduction, we're going to eliminate the dampening that's done by this damper rod, and we're going to turn that job over to these cartridges here. So they're going to handle the oil flow and the resistance to the oil flow that creates the dampening in the fork. But we've got to eliminate that function here in the dampening rod, and the way we do that is we drill holes in it so that the oil can flow freely in and out of the bottom of this rod. These 2 holes that are in it are in it from the factory, and the oil has to pass through these 2 holes in order for the fork tube to compress down into the fork leg or to rebound out. All the oil has to pass through these 2 little holes. The resistance to that flow, because it necks it down, it can't flow through there very quickly. That resistance is what creates the dampening in the fork leg. So we're going to open these 2 holes up bigger. We're going to go to a 5/16 hole, and we're going to drill 4 more holes in here, a 5/16. That will allow enough oil to move in and out of this rod that it won't affect, the fork will be able to move freely in the oil. The resistance through the 6 holes that we're going to have, and they're going to be larger than this, won't affect that. So then that'll allow the cartridge that sits on top here, the oil flows up and goes up and down in inside of the tube here. We're going to have the cartridge, the emulator, sitting on top of that, and all that oil is going to have to go through this cartridge. This guy's going to do the job of the dampening, and it'll be eliminated down here in the rod. So we're going to drill these 2 original holes out to 5/16. We need 2 more holes cross drilled through this at 90 degrees. So right in between these 2 holes that are in it, and 10 millimeters above the center line will be the center line for this next set of holes. I've taken my calipers and set them to 10 millimeters. Went to the center line of the hole here, and I've etched a line around this at 10 millimeters. So then I just turn 90 degrees right in between the holes, and I've marked right in between the holes, these 2 at 10 millimeters above them. This will be where my next set of holes will go. The 3rd set of holes will be 20 millimeters above the original center line of the original holes. And I've done the same thing, and they will be in line with those holes. Okay. There we go. There's one. Well, I've got my damper rod drilled out here, and you can kind of see how that looks after it's done. We got 6 holes in it. The bottom 2 holes here were the originals, and I enlarged them to 5/16. And then the other 4 that we marked, I started out with 1/8" drill bit and drilled into those, drilled them through, and then I went up to a 3/16 drill bit, and then finally a 5/16. I went over the holes. They got some nasty burrs and stuff on the edges of them. I went over them with a file. Then I took a really small little fine file, and it's a half round. It's half round on one side, and I had to go in here to get the inside lip. I used this file and just worked the inside edge all the way around in each hole, so that took some time. Now I'll blow this out with some compressed air and use some maybe some parts cleaner or brake cleaner, spray in there and blow it out and make sure I get all the metal dust out of this before I go any farther. Well, we got our damper rod all cleaned up. We filed out the edges of all those holes. I blew it out, sprayed it out with parts cleaner, and I got it pretty clean. It's looking pretty good, and it's nice and smooth. So I think we did a pretty good job on that one. We got our 6 holes in it. And on top of the damper rod, we got a seal. You got to make sure it's on there. That's what seals the fluid off from the bottom and the top of the tube. This is what makes the whole system work. You got to have a good seal, so make sure this seal is in place like it was when you took it apart there, and it is. Our damper rod and this return spring have to go in our tube just like this and go all the way down to the bottom here. And make sure our seal is in place here, and it is in the top of our damper rod. I'm going to take a little fork oil and oil this seal just a bit. Get some oil on that. Make sure our rebound return spring is in place up under here. This will just go down like this, and it should come out the bottom of the tube just like that. We've got a cup here that this damper rod sits in, so we got to make sure that's in place. So I'm going to put that there, and our damper rod is setting in that. In our fork leg, the bolt that goes in the end of the damper rod here that holds it all in place, it goes through that cup and into the damper rod, and it bolts the damper rod and the cup down into the bottom of this fork leg. There's also a copper washer that goes under this to seal it so it doesn't leak, and that washer has stuck. It's stayed in the hole in place, so I just left it there. I'm just going to put the bolt back in, and I think the copper washer will seal up again just fine. I think it'll be all right. This is our lower bushing on our tube. That runs in this bore inside the fork leg. I'm going to put some oil on that. Before you reassemble, it's a real good time to inspect your fork tube here for any dings or chips or scratches, anything where it might have got debris had hit it. These are exposed on the V-Strom. When you're riding down the road, your fork tube is exposed, and you can get chips in it. If you got chips, you need to take some fine emery cloth, some 1000 or 1200 and a little oil, and work those out and get them smooth so they don't tear up your new seals. And you'll wind up with a seal leak if you get your tubes dinged up or whatever. My damper rod in this cap, and I'm just going to set it about like that. And I'm going to install that right into this fork leg just like it is right there, and try to just ease it down to the bottom.
all the way without disturbing anything, and that should line everything up where I can get this bolt in. We'll see how this goes. Okay, we got her in there nice and snug. All right, we got her in there nice and snug. Got the bolt started in the bottom there into the damper rod through the cup. The next piece of the puzzle is the bushing, the upper bushing. The upper bushing presses into an area. It goes over the fork tube, and then we got a seal driver. We can drive that bushing into place here. So we've got our bushing slid down over our tube, and it's kind of started. We got this washer that sits on top of the bushing that was there. We're going to put this in, and this will allow my driver to slide over, and I can drive that bushing down into the bottom of its where it seats at down here in this tube. And when it's all the way down, this will be just about down to the fork leg here. You can kind of watch it as that bushing goes down. That just gets close. This will just get closer and closer. And there you can hear it bottom out. So that bushing's all the way in place now. And then we've got our seal. We've got new seals here. I got some oil in it on the lip seal. The lips go down. If you ever wonder, the edge of the seal that lips in goes down towards the oil. So we'll put this on in that direction with the lip down. Pretty much slide it into place, and this seal driver will just, the sound gets, you can tell feel that it's bottomed out there. The groove that this goes in will be just above the seal in here for this to snap into, and I can see it. So we'll put our retainer back in here, and you just kind of got to work it in. And I'm just going to push it down. I can see that it's snapped into the groove. I don't know if you can see it, but you should be able to. There's a little groove in the sidewall that it snaps into. So we got that back in place. Once we get our retainer back on top of our seal in there and snapped into place, well, then we can go ahead and put our dust cover, our little a wiper, I guess they call it, or dust shield. It's the last thing that goes on, and you can usually just press this in with your hand. Slide this over, and then, yeah, I was able to just push that down by hand. And then our tube is assembled. Our setup sheet says that we need to bring the oil level, our oil that we're going to put back in here, our 10 weight, up to 5.3 inches from the top of the tube up here, with the spring out but the emulator in. So I'm going to go ahead before I drop that emulator in there, that cartridge, and just put a little oil in here and not run it up that high. But I want to get the air out of the leg here below the damper rod. So I'm just going to work my fork leg up and down. Okay, my oil level dropped quite a bit then. Pour a little more in there. That was a whole, what, 16 ounces right there. I don't hear any more air or anything that sounds like air in there, so I think we probably got it out. So the next thing I'm going to do, drop in my cartridge. The spring goes up and the bottom of it with the nut goes down. And I think I'll just lower it down in there with a little magnet on a stick here that I've got. I'll just drop it down in there and then kind of rake the stick off. Let that drop down. So we've got our emulator dropped in there on top of our damper leg. The next thing we need to do is set our oil level. They told us how high from the top of the tube our oil level needs to be in our setup sheet. the Gold Valve people did. And they're saying it needs to be 5.3 inches from the top to where the oil should be. And I am below that. All right, that's pretty close there. We'll get our tape measure and see how we did. So we do the oil level with the spring out, the emulator in. We've already gotten all the air out of it, and we got to do it with the tube all the way down, push it all the way to the bottom, and that's where we take our measurement. So 5.3 would be right about there. And I got just a little too much oil in it, so I'm just going to pour out just a little bit back into this. So I'll check it from the top again, and I'll just run this down to about 5.3, which is just over 5 1/4. And my tape measure just barely touched the oil. So we're pretty good right there. We're about 5.3. All right, so we've got our oil in there, the correct level. The next thing we can do, we can put our new spring in. We'll just ease it down in there and try to not make a big mess. Kind of jiggle it around, make sure it falls down in on top of the valve. Well, I slid that fork leg back up through the triple tree, through the lower triple tree down here, and up into the upper triple tree. The fork leg is just hanging all the way extended. So that's the way it needs to be for this next step. I snugged up the bolts in the lower triple tree. So the top of our fork tube here at the upper triple tree clamp, the very lip of the tube is just barely sticking up above the clamp, maybe a millimeter. You want the cap, when it bolts, when you screw the cap down onto this, you want to be sure that it seats against the tube and not against the triple tree. So it needs to be sticking up just a little bit, but it's just barely, just enough that the cap will hit the tube and not the triple tree. We've got our spring is installed, and we got that washer sitting on top of the spring. So now it's time for the spacer. So I'm using 1-inch PVC for spacers is what I've been using. And I just cut a piece that I know is going to be too long. And there it's sitting on top of the washer on top of the spring. Everything's in place. So now I need to measure my preload. We're going to do our preload and cut this spacer to the correct length. Our cap is going to sit on top of the spacer. And we've also got another washer. The washer will sit on top of the spacer and then the cap, just like this. We need the distance between the top of the tube right here that's just barely sticking up above the triple tree and the bottom lip of the cap that's gonna sit on top of the tube. The cap right here above the O-ring seal. There's a lip there, and that's gonna be down on that tube. We need that distance to equal 1.4 inches, according to the chart they gave me. So I'm going to measure it now and see what it is, and then I'll calculate what how much I need to take off of it so it'll come out to 1.4 inches. So I'm not pushing down, I'm just letting it sit there. And we are right at 4 inches right there to the bottom of that lip on the cap. I'll need to shorten that by 2.6 inches, and that should give me a preload height of 1.4 inches. I've cut my spacer down, set it back down in here. I'll put my washer and my cap back on there like that. And we are at 1 3/8 inches. So that's pretty close to 1.4 inches of preload right there. I think I'll go with that. All right, I got her started. That was pretty easy.
And we'll run this down. And now I can see that my cap is actually seated on the fork tube and it's not touching the triple tree. It's just barely above it. We're going to tighten up our pinch bolts. We've got 17 foot-pounds on this upper one, and then we'll snug the bottom ones to 16. The two lower ones there on the lower triple tree to 16 foot-pounds. There's 17 pounds. I went ahead and I got the left fork, all the work done on it, and I've reassembled it and got it back up in the bike. It's the same, exact same as the right fork. There's no difference in it. I've got my calipers on and my axle bolt in here. We're going to torque the axle bolt to 47 foot-pounds, according to what the book says. Okay. The pinch bolt for the axle, we're going to leave that loose for now. We need to work the suspension a little bit, let the forks kind of find their happy place, and then we'll tighten this one up. Our calipers are 28 foot-pounds. Okay. And I've got the bike back on the ground now. And if you look down here on this fork, I've got a tie wrap wrapped around it, kind of snug. So I'm going to check my how much rebound I have above the ride height on the bike. I had it calculated for about 20 millimeters, so we'll see what we've got here. So I'm just going to push that down, and I'm going to get on the bike. I'll reach in here and push this all the way down. I'm standing up now. My weight isn't on the bike too much. And now I'm going to sit down on the bike and put all my weight on it. So that's the ride height right there. When I'm going down the road, that's where we're running. So now I'll get off the bike and put it back up on the stand here. Oops. That's how much sag I've got in the suspension when I'm on it. And I had it calculated for about 20 millimeters, which is just under an inch. Let's see what we've got now. We'll measure this. We've got 21 millimeters right here. So that's close enough for the girls I hang out with. The last thing I need to do, I still haven't tightened that pinch bolt down there on the bottom of the fork leg. And before I do that, I want to work the suspension just a little bit, as much as I can, and kind of let that fork find its happy spot. It can still slide back and forth on that axle. So we'll kind of do this a little bit. That's probably good enough. It tightens to 17 foot-pounds. I've got my wrench all set up. There it is. We're ready to go for a ride. Well, we've taken the V-Strom for its maiden voyage on the new suspension, and I gotta say it's pretty impressive. The bike's really good on the highway. It soaks everything up. It's still good in the twisties on the highway. You get feedback from the road. It's not vague or wallowy. It's well planted, just like it was, but it does soak the cracks in the road and the holes and stuff up really well. But when you get off-road with it onto the gravel and crossing creeks and stuff and hitting rocks, it's absolutely brilliant. I can't believe the difference it makes. It soaks that stuff up. It doesn't send it all to the rider. The suspension actually works now. So I would say if you've got a damper rod type suspension on your motorcycle and you want to improve it, if it's too harsh for you off-road or on the gravel, this is the way to go. Put the cartridge emulators in your forks, and your suspension will actually start to work for you. The damper rod suspension just cannot react fast enough to absorb those sharp hits. Washboards or rocks, the damper rod just can't deal with it. These emulators do a real good job. It feels like an upside down cartridge type front end on it there. It's really nice. For those of you who have made it this far, I commend you. This is a very long video, but we had a lot to go over, and I wanted to make sure I covered everything I could. So if folks are going to try to do this, why, they'll know what they're getting into and know what to expect. I invite you all to come back and see me. We'll go some places and do some other things. Till I catch up with you again, you all take care of yourselves. We'll catch you next time.